She hadn't spoken a word since the night her father's barn burned down. The town of Copper Ridge called her damaged goods, a burden no man would carry. But when a drifting cowboy with a guitar heard her humming in the church garden, he stopped mid-song and said something that would shatter everything she believed about herself. "Your eyes speak louder than words ever could." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana sky stretched wide and indifferent over Copper Ridge, a town small enough that everyone knew your name, but large enough to pretend they didn't see your pain. The year was 1912, and the wind carried dust through the streets like whispered secrets no one wanted to hear. Elena Garrett moved through the morning market with her wicker basket pressed against her ribs, her steps careful and measured. She was 23 years old, though her eyes held the weariness of someone who had lived twice that long. Her dark hair was pulled back severely beneath a faded bonnet, and her dress hung loose on a frame that had forgotten what it meant to be fed with care. She didn't speak because she couldn't. The words had died in her throat 18 years ago, the night the flames took her father and left her voice buried in the ashes. The town doctor had examined her afterward, found no physical damage, and declared it a mystery of the mind. Her mother had wept and prayed, but the silence remained, thick and permanent as stone. Now Elena lived in the back room of the general store, kept there by the widow Pritchard, a woman whose charity was measured in exact portions and whose kindness came with invoices. Elena stocked shelves, swept floors, and slept on a cot beneath a window that wouldn't open. In exchange, she received meals scraped from the bottom of pots and dresses, passed down from women who had died or moved away. The market that morning buzzed with the usual commerce. Farmers traded grain for tools, women compared fabric prices, and children chased each other between wagons. Elena stopped at the vegetable stand, pointing to a bundle of carrots. The vendor, a man named Harris, with tobacco-stained teeth, didn't look at her directly. "Widow Pritchard's order?" he asked, the air beside her head. Elena nodded. Harris wrapped the carrots in brown paper without another word. No greeting, no small talk, nothing that might acknowledge her as fully human. She took the bundle, placed 2 coins on the wooden counter, and turned away. As she moved through the crowd, a young mother pulled her child closer when Elena passed. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but Elena had learned to read these movements like others read newspapers. The mother's eyes held no malice, just that particular blend of pity and discomfort that people wore when confronted with something broken they couldn't fix. Near the hardware stall, 2 men in their 30s leaned against a post, watching the women pass. One of them, Thomas Fletcher, had courted 3 girls in the past year. When Elena walked by, he didn't even turn his head. His companion muttered something low, and Thomas laughed, the sound carrying across the space between them like a verdict. Elena kept walking. She had stopped feeling shame about such moments years ago. Shame required hope, and hope required the belief that things could be different. The church stood at the end of Main Street, its white paint peeling in long strips that revealed grey wood beneath. Father Vincent kept the doors open during the day, a gesture of welcome that few took advantage of outside of Sunday services. Elena often slipped inside during her errands, not to pray exactly, but to sit in the cool dimness where no one expected anything from her. She entered through the side door, the one that led to the small garden where the church grew herbs and vegetables for the poor. The garden was empty at this hour, which was why Elena preferred it. She set down her basket and knelt beside a patch of sage, running her fingers over the silver-green leaves. The humming started without her meaning it to. It always did. Where her voice had failed, melody remained, though she kept it quiet, barely audible even to herself. The tune was something her father had sung while working in the evenings, a simple folk melody without words. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching until they stopped. "That's a lonesome sound," came a voice, low and gentle. Elena's hands froze. She looked up slowly. The man standing at the garden gate was a stranger, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore trail-worn clothes, a battered hat, and carried a guitar case slung across his back. His face was unshaven but not unkempt, and when he looked at her, he actually looked at her, not through her or past her. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, removing his hat. "I heard the humming and thought maybe someone needed help." Elena stood quickly, brushing dirt from her skirt. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She shook her head, the universal gesture for, "I'm fine. Leave me alone." But the stranger didn't leave. He stepped into the garden, moving with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to open spaces. "Name's Jesse Dalton," he said. "Just rode into town this morning. Looking for work, maybe a place to rest a few days." Elena pointed toward the church, then toward the street, trying to indicate that Father Vincent might help him. Jesse followed her gesture, then looked back at her with something like understanding. "You don't talk much, I'm guessing." She shook her head. "Can't or won't." Elena hesitated, then touched her throat and shook her head again. Jesse's expression shifted, not to pity, but to something closer to recognition. "I knew a man once who lost his voice in a mine collapse, couldn't speak for 3 years, but he could still sing, after a fashion, humming like you were doing." He paused. "Your eyes speak louder than words ever could anyway." Elena felt something crack inside her chest, a sensation so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify it. Someone was seeing her. Not the broken thing, not the burden, not the ghost moving through the market. Her. Before she could respond in any way, the side door of the church banged open. Widow Pritchard emerged, her face pinched with irritation. "Elena, I've been looking everywhere for you. Those vegetables won't sort themselves." Jesse turned toward the widow, his posture shifting subtly, becoming more formal. "Ma'am, I was just asking this young lady for directions." Widow Pritchard's eyes narrowed as she took in Jesse's appearance, his guitar, his road-worn clothes. "We don't need drifters loitering in the church garden. Elena, come along." "Now." Elena picked up her basket, but as she moved toward the widow, she glanced back at Jesse. He was watching her with that same steady gaze, and he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt like a promise. The general store smelled of dust and dried goods, a scent that had seeped into Elena's clothes and skin over the years. Widow Pritchard ran the establishment with an iron efficiency, every can aligned, every price marked clearly, every transaction recorded in her leather-bound ledger. Elena spent the afternoon in the back room, sorting through crates of canned goods. Her fingers worked mechanically, checking for dents and rust, organizing by type and date. Through the thin wall, she could hear the widow speaking with customers, her voice alternating between syrupy sweetness for the wealthy and clipped efficiency for everyone else. "Such a shame about that girl," came Mrs. Henderson's voice during a lull. "Pretty enough face, but what man wants a wife who can't even say good morning?" "The Lord tests us all in different ways," Widow Pritchard replied, her tone suggesting she considered Elena's muteness a personal inconvenience. "I do what I can out of Christian duty, but she'll be my burden until the day I die, I suppose." Elena's hands stilled on a can of peaches. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times, but repetition hadn't dulled the sting. She was a burden, a duty, a test of someone else's virtue. That evening, after the store closed and the widow retired to her upstairs rooms, Elena sat by the small window in her quarters. The glass was dirty, filtering the sunset into shades of rust and amber. From somewhere down the street came the sound of a guitar, the notes clear and purposeful. She recognized the melody after a few bars. It was the same tune she had been humming in the garden, her father's song. But Jesse was playing it with variations, adding complexity and depth, transforming it into something both familiar and entirely new. Elena pressed her hand against the glass, listening. The music continued for perhaps 20 minutes, weaving through old hymns and frontier ballads, each song played with a skill that spoke of years of practice. When it finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. The next morning brought rain, a cold autumn drizzle that turned the streets to mud and kept most people indoors. Elena was sweeping the store's front porch when she saw Jesse walking past, guitar case covered with an oilcloth, heading toward the livery stable. He noticed her and altered his course, climbing the steps to stand under the porch roof. Water dripped from his hat brim. "Morning," he said. Elena nodded, continuing to sweep. "Found work at the stable," Jesse continued, seemingly unbothered by her silence. "Seems the regular hand broke his leg last week. They need someone to muck stalls and tend the horses until he heals." He glanced toward the grey sky. "Not glamorous, but it's honest." Elena paused her sweeping, meeting his eyes briefly. "I was thinking," Jesse said, "if you ever want to hear some music, I usually play in the evenings, down by the livery, or sometimes at the church, if Father Vincent allows it." He smiled slightly. "No charge for listening. Just seems like this town could use some songs." Before Elena could respond in any way, the store door opened. Widow Pritchard stood in the threshold, her arms crossed. "Mr. Dalton, if you're not here to purchase something, I'll ask you to move along. Elena has work to do." Jesse tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am, just being neighborly." He looked at Elena once more, and something in his expression suggested he understood far more than the widow realized. As he walked away, Widow Pritchard gripped Elena's shoulder, her fingers digging in just enough to hurt. "You stay away from that one," she hissed. "Drifters like him are nothing but trouble. They come through with pretty words and guitar strings, and they leave girls ruined." She released Elena and stepped back inside. "Finish that porch, and then scrub the floors. All of them." Elena bent to her work, but her mind remained on the music she had heard the night before, and the way Jesse had looked at her like she was worth seeing. The days that followed established a pattern. Jesse worked at the livery from dawn until dusk, and in the evenings he played his guitar. Sometimes in front of the stable, sometimes at the church, once even in the town square, where a small crowd gathered despite themselves. Elena listened from wherever she could, always at a distance, always careful not to draw attention. The music was unlike anything Copper Ridge usually heard. Jesse played old songs and new ones, ballads about lost loves and train whistles, melodies that spoke of wide-open spaces and the particular loneliness of the American frontier. She noticed that others were drawn to it too. Children would stop their games to listen. Women paused in their evening routines. Even the men, who generally considered music an unnecessary frivolity, would linger within earshot, pretending to check their horses or examine their wagon wheels. But it was Jesse's voice that truly captivated. When he sang, his rough baritone carried across the evening air with a quality that seemed to reach inside and touch something people had forgotten they possessed. He sang of home and heartache, of morning light on mountain peaks, of promises kept and broken, and of the stubborn human hope that persisted despite everything. Elena found herself humming along when she was alone, matching her wordless melodies to his voiced ones, creating a private duet that no one else could hear. One evening, as she carried out the store's trash to the burn barrel behind the building, she found Jesse sitting on the back steps of the livery, guitar in his lap, working through a new arrangement. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "Evening," he said. Then, without preamble, "You know, I've been thinking about that song you were humming. Your father's song, I'm guessing?" Elena's breath caught. She nodded slowly. "It's a good one. Strong melody, room for variation." Jesse adjusted a string on his guitar. "Would you mind if I played it sometimes?" "I'd like to, but only if you're comfortable with it." The question surprised her. No one had asked her permission for anything in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. She nodded again, more firmly this time. "Much obliged," Jesse said. He began to play, and the familiar melody filled the narrow space between buildings. But then he did something unexpected. He played only the instrumental parts, leaving gaps where the voice should be, creating space for someone else to fill. Elena understood what he was offering. She glanced around, confirming they were alone, and then she hummed. Quietly at first, then with growing confidence as Jesse's guitar supported and amplified her wordless voice. They played together for perhaps 5 minutes, the melody weaving between them like a conversation neither needed words to complete. When the song ended, Jesse looked at her with an expression of deep respect. "That's a gift you've got," he said simply. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wanted to say thank you, to explain what those words meant, to tell him about the 18 years of silence and the way music was the only thing that still connected her to the person she used to be. But all she could do was place her hand over her heart and bow her head slightly. Jesse seemed to understand. "Anytime you want to play," he said, "you know where to find me." As Elena walked back to the store, her steps felt lighter than they had in years. The burden of invisibility, of being something broken that people looked through rather than at, seemed to lift just slightly. For the first time since the fire that had stolen her voice, she felt the faint stirring of something she was afraid to name. But in the window of the general store's second floor, Widow Pritchard stood watching, her face set in hard lines of disapproval. And across the street, in the shadows of the bank's awning, a man named Samuel Garrett leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the livery with an expression that promised nothing good. Elena didn't see either of them. She was too busy remembering the feeling of being heard. The Garrett family owned half of Copper Ridge, and Samuel Garrett made sure no one forgot it. His father had built the bank, the feed store, and most of the commercial buildings that lined Main Street. When the old man died 3 years back, Samuel inherited not just property and accounts, but the quiet power that came from holding other people's debts. Samuel was 37, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, with the kind of sharp-featured handsomeness that had hardened into something cold. He wore tailored suits, even in a town where most men lived in work clothes, and he walked with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. Elena was his cousin, though the connection was distant enough that most people in town had forgotten. Her father had been Samuel's uncle by marriage, a farmer who worked rented land and died owing money. When the fire took him, Samuel had been the one to settle the debts by selling off everything the man had owned. He'd also been the one to arrange Elena's placement with Widow Pritchard, calling it charity, while charging the widow a reduced rate on her store lease in exchange. In Samuel's mind, this made Elena his responsibility. More importantly, it made her his property. He had watched her grow from a traumatized child into a silent young woman, and as the years passed, his interest had shifted from dutiful oversight to something darker. She was beautiful in a way that didn't demand attention, and her muteness appealed to him. A wife who couldn't argue, couldn't refuse, couldn't tell secrets. The idea had taken root slowly, but now it occupied his thoughts with increasing frequency. The morning after Jesse and Elena played music together, Samuel stood in his office above the bank, looking down at the street below. He had seen them behind the livery the previous evening, watched the easy way the drifter spoke to her, noticed the animation in Elena's face that was usually so carefully blank. His jaw tightened. He pulled the cord that rang the bell for his clerk. Martin Crawford appeared moments later, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the perpetually nervous demeanor of someone who lived in fear of unemployment. "Yes, Mr. Garrett, that man working at Hutchinson's livery, the one with the guitar. Find out everything about him." Samuel turned from the window. "Where he's from, where he's going, why he's here. I want to know by tomorrow." Crawford nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Anything particular you're concerned about? Just do it." After Crawford left, Samuel sat at his mahogany desk and opened the ledger that tracked the Pritchard store's accounts. The widow was 3 months behind on her lease, a fact he had allowed to slide because she served a useful purpose. But leverage was leverage, and he could feel the need for it approaching like a storm on the horizon. At the general store, Widow Pritchard was conducting her own form of control. Elena knelt on the wooden floor, scrubbing with a stiff brush and lye soap that had already cracked the skin on her hands. The widow stood over her, arms folded, delivering a lecture that had been building since the previous evening. "I took you in when no one else would," she said, her voice tight with righteousness. "Fed you, clothed you, gave you a roof and purpose. And this is how you repay me?" Carrying on with some vagrant behind the livery stable like a common harlot, Elena kept scrubbing, her shoulders hunched. She had learned years ago that responding in any way, even with a shake of her head, only prolonged these speeches. "You think I don't see things? Think I don't know what men like that want?" The widow's voice rose. "He looks at you and sees easy prey, a girl who can't scream, can't tell anyone what happened. He'll ruin you and move on, and then where will you be? Who'll take you in then?" The brush scraped against the floorboards, the sound rhythmic and harsh. "I'm trying to protect you, girl. You're damaged enough without adding to it." The widow moved closer, her shadow falling across Elena's work. "Your cousin Samuel came by yesterday, asked after you, how you were managing. He's a good man, patient. Not many would be willing to consider taking on someone like you, but he's family. He understands duty." Elena's hands went still. A coldness spread through her chest, sharp and suffocating. She looked up at the widow, her eyes wide with something between fear and betrayal. "Don't look at me like that." "Widow," Pritchard snapped, "you should be grateful that someone of his standing would even think of you. Most girls in your position would be left to rot or end up in a brothel. Samuel could give you security, a proper home. What more could you possibly want?" Elena stood abruptly, the brush clattering to the floor. She pointed to her chest, then shook her head violently. "Oh, don't be dramatic. You'll do as you're told when the time comes." The widow bent to pick up the brush and thrust it back at Elena. "Now finish this floor and then start on the inventory. We have a shipment coming tomorrow." That afternoon, while Elena stocked shelves in the back room, she heard the bell above the front door jingle. Through the crack in the door she saw Samuel enter, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said warmly, "always a pleasure. Mr. Garrett, what brings you by?" The widow's tone had transformed into something almost girlish. "Just checking on things, making sure everything's running smoothly." Samuel's eyes drifted toward the back room. "How's my cousin managing?" "Oh, Elena's fine, working hard, staying out of trouble. Mostly." The widow lowered her voice, but not enough, though I did have to have a word with her about that musician fellow, the drifter at the livery. Samuel's expression didn't change, but something in his posture sharpened. "Musician? Jesse Dalton, I believe his name is. Been playing his guitar in the evenings, drawing crowds. Elena's been listening, and I caught them together behind the buildings last night. Nothing improper that I saw. But you know how these things start. I appreciate you telling me." Samuel's voice remained pleasant, but Elena, watching through the crack, saw his hand tighten on his hat brim. "I'll make sure it doesn't become a problem. She's a good girl, really, just simple, you know, easily led astray without proper guidance." "Indeed." Samuel placed a small envelope on the counter. "For the lease, consider the next 3 months settled. And, Mrs. Pritchard, I wonder if I might have a word with Elena, just briefly, to see how she's doing." The widow's face brightened at the sight of the envelope. "Of course! Elena, come out here, girl." Elena emerged slowly, her eyes downcast. She stopped several feet away from Samuel, her hands clasped in front of her. Samuel smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Elena, you're looking well. Mrs. Pritchard tells me you've been working hard." She nodded once. "I wanted to let you know I've been thinking about you. About your future." He took a step closer. You're not getting any younger, and it's not right for a woman of your station to remain unmarried. People talk, you know. Wonder what's wrong. Elena's breathing quickened, but she kept her eyes down. I've decided it's time I take a more active role in your welfare. After all, your family. It's my duty. Samuel reached out and lifted her chin with one finger, forcing her to look at him. We'll talk more about this soon, but I want you to understand something. That drifter, the guitar player, he's not for you. Men like that are dangerous, especially to girls in your vulnerable position. Do you understand? Elena tried to pull away, but Samuel's grip tightened slightly, his fingers pressing into the soft flesh beneath her jaw. I asked you a question, Elena. Nod if you understand. After a long moment, Elena nodded. Samuel released her, his smile returning. Good girl. Mrs. Pritchard, thank you for your time. I'll check in again soon. After he left, Elena stood frozen in the middle of the store. The widow busied herself counting the money from the envelope, humming softly, apparently oblivious to or unconcerned by what had just transpired. That evening, Elena didn't go to listen to Jessie play. Instead, she sat in her small room, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at the wall. The bars of her cage had just become visible, and she could feel them closing in. At the livery stable, Jessie played for a smaller crowd than usual. Father Vincent had stopped by, along with a few families and some curious children, but his eyes kept drifting to the general store, looking for a figure that never appeared. When the music ended and the crowd dispersed, Father Vincent lingered. He was an older man, in his 60s, with kind eyes and hands worn from decades of service. That was beautiful, son, he said. You've got a real gift. Thank you, Father. I noticed you looking for someone. The priest's tone was gentle but knowing. The Garrett girl, perhaps? Jessie met his eyes. She likes music. I thought she might come. Father Vincent sighed, settling onto a nearby barrel. Elena's situation is complicated. She's lived under the widow's roof for 9 years now, ever since the fire. It's not a happy arrangement, but it's kept her fed and housed. Doesn't seem right, the way that woman talks to her. No, it doesn't, but this town has its ways, and they're not easily changed. The priest paused. Samuel Garrett has been showing increased interest in Elena lately. He's her only living relation, and he has the means to provide for her. Many people see that as the natural solution to her circumstances. Jessie's jaw tightened. And what does Elena see it as? I don't know. She can't tell us. Father Vincent stood, placing a hand on Jessie's shoulder. Be careful, son. I like you, and I think your presence here has been good for this town. But powerful men don't like having their plans disrupted, and Samuel Garrett is very powerful. I'm just playing music, Father. Are you? The priest studied him for a long moment. Well, keep playing then. But watch yourself. After Father Vincent left, Jessie sat alone in the gathering darkness, his guitar across his lap. He thought about Elena's eyes when she hummed, the way she came alive when music filled the space between them. He thought about the fear he'd seen flash across her face when the widow interrupted them. He had seen this pattern before, in other towns, other situations. The powerful protecting their interests, the vulnerable trapped by circumstances they couldn't escape, and everyone else looking away. It was easier than getting involved. Jessie had spent the last 5 years drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots or make attachments. It was safer that way, cleaner. He'd learned the hard cost of caring too much, of fighting battles that couldn't be won. But something about Elena had gotten under his skin. Maybe it was the music they'd made together, or the intelligence he saw in her eyes, despite her silence, or simply the recognition of someone else carrying wounds that wouldn't heal right. He didn't want to care. He shouldn't care. But as he sat there in the dark, guitar growing cold in his hands, he knew he already did. The next morning, Martin Crawford delivered his report to Samuel Garrett. Jesse Dalton, age 32, born in Kansas, had worked as a ranch hand, railroad laborer, and itinerant musician. No criminal record, no outstanding debts, no family that anyone knew of. He moved frequently, never staying anywhere longer than a few months. Several sources mentioned a tragic incident about 5 years back involving a woman he'd been courting, but details were scarce. Samuel absorbed this information with satisfaction. A rootless drifter with a past he didn't talk about. Perfect ammunition when the time came to discredit him. "There's one more thing," Crawford said hesitantly. "People are talking about his music, saying it's brought some life back to the town. Even Sheriff Morrison mentioned it. Said the evenings seem more peaceful when there's music playing." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "The sheriff said that?" "Yes, sir. Seems like folks are taking to him." This was inconvenient. Samuel had planned to simply run the man out of town, but if Jesse had already earned goodwill, it would need to be handled more carefully. He would need to turn the town against him first, make them see the danger rather than the entertainment. "Thank you, Crawford. That will be all." After his clerk left, Samuel drafted a letter to the owner of the livery stable, a man who owed the bank considerably more than he could comfortably repay. The letter was cordial, merely mentioning concerns about the character of certain employees and suggesting that perhaps a more thorough vetting process might be prudent. Nothing direct, nothing that could be called a threat, just a gentle reminder of where the real power lay. At the general store, Elena's hands shook as she wrapped purchases for customers. Sleep had been impossible the night before, her mind churning with images of Samuel's cold smile and the widow's casual talk of marriage. She felt like an animal being herded into a pen, everyone else deciding her fate while she had no voice to protest. During a quiet moment, she slipped into the back room and pulled out a small wooden box she kept hidden beneath her cot. Inside were the few possessions she had salvaged from the fire: a photograph of her parents, her mother's wedding ring, and a child's drawing of a barn done in her own hand years ago. She looked at the drawing, remembering the girl who had made it, that Elena had spoken freely, laughed loudly, run through fields without fear, that Elena had believed the world was fundamentally good, that her father would always be there to protect her, that her voice mattered. The fire had taken more than her father's life. It had taken her belief in her own worth, her ability to shape her own future, her fundamental sense of safety in the world. And now, 18 years later, she was being told that the best she could hope for was to belong to a man who looked at her like she was something to be acquired and controlled. Elena closed the box and returned it to its hiding place. As she did, she heard the bell above the front door jingle. Through the crack, she saw Jesse enter, hat in hand. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said politely, "I was hoping to buy some supplies, trail rations if you have them." The widow's voice was cold. "Leaving us so soon, Mr. Dalton?" "No, ma'am. Just like to keep some provisions on hand. Never know when you might need to move on." "I see." There was a pause. "Elena, come help Mr. Dalton with his purchases." Elena emerged, her heart hammering. She couldn't look at Jesse directly, afraid of what her face might reveal. "Morning," Jesse said softly. She could hear the question in his voice, the concern. "Missed you last night? Hope everything's all right." Elena nodded quickly, moving to gather the items he'd requested. Her hands were unsteady as she wrapped dried meat and hard biscuits in brown paper. Jesse watched her, and when she handed him the packages, their fingers touched briefly. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "If you ever need help, you let me know. Any way you can, I'll be there." Elena's eyes met his for just a second, long enough for him to see the fear and gratitude warring in them. Then she stepped back, putting safe distance between them. Widow Pritchard appeared in the doorway, her presence a wall between them. "That'll be $2, Mr. Dalton." Jesse paid and left without another word. As the door closed behind him, the widow gripped Elena's arm, her nails digging in. "I saw that," she hissed. "You think I'm blind? One more incident like that, and I'll tell Mr. Garrett you've been encouraging that man's attentions. Do you understand what that would mean?" Elena understood perfectly. It would give Samuel all the justification he needed to accelerate whatever plans he had for her, framed as protection from her own poor judgment. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Elena heard music drifting through the cold air. Jessie was playing something mournful and beautiful, a melody that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the frontier in its notes. She pressed her face into her thin pillow and hummed along silently, tears finally coming after being held back for so long. The cage was closing, and she could see no way out. The letter arrived at the livery stable on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Martin Crawford, with an apologetic expression and eyes that wouldn't meet Jessie's. The owner, Mr. Hutchinson, read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it in his shirt pocket. "Jessie, can we talk in my office?" The office was barely more than a closet with a desk, papers stacked in precarious towers on every surface. Hutchinson was a good man, weathered by years of honest labor and honest debt, and the conflict on his face was plain to see. "I got to let you go," he said without preamble. "It's not your work. You've been the best hand I've had in years, but I can't afford to keep you on." Jessie leaned against the doorframe, studying the older man. "This have anything to do with Samuel Garrett?" Hutchinson's silence was answer enough. "He owns your debt," Jessie said. "It wasn't a question. Owns damn near everyone's debt in this town." Hutchinson pulled out the letter. "Didn't threaten me outright. Just expressed concerns about my judgment in hiring. Suggested that a man in my position needs to be more careful about who he associates with." He looked up at Jessie with genuine regret. "I got a wife and 3 children, son. I can't lose this business." Jessie nodded slowly. He'd expected something like this, though perhaps not quite so soon. "I understand. When do you need me gone? End of the week? Give you time to find something else. Though I won't lie to you, it's going to be hard. Word will spread fast." "Appreciate the honesty." Jessie pushed off the doorframe. "I'll finish out the week strong." As he returned to mucking the stalls, his mind worked through the implications. Samuel was making his move, cutting off Jessie's reasons to stay in Copper Ridge. It was a smart play, quiet and effective. No confrontation, no scene, just economic pressure applied to someone who couldn't resist it. The question was, what Samuel would do next. By afternoon, the news had traveled through town with the speed of wildfire. Jessie was being let go from the livery. Speculation buzzed about why, theories ranging from poor work to some unspecified moral failing. Samuel had been careful not to spell out his concerns, leaving room for imagination to do the work. At the general store, Elena heard the news from Mrs. Henderson, who told Widow Pritchard while purchasing flour. "Such a shame, Mrs." Henderson said, though her tone suggested she found it more interesting than shameful. "Though I suppose Hutchinson has to protect his business. Can't be too careful these days." Elena's hands froze on the can she was dusting. Jessie was losing his job. Because of her, she was certain. Samuel was clearing the field of obstacles. That evening, she waited until the widow was occupied with her account books before slipping out the back door. The air was cold, autumn giving way to the bite of early winter, and she had no shawl, but she didn't care. She needed to find Jessie. He wasn't at the livery. She checked behind the building where they'd played music together, but the space was empty. Finally, she heard guitar strings from the direction of the church and followed the sound. Jessie sat on the church steps, playing for no audience but himself. The melody was different from his usual repertoire, something minor and unresolved, matching the grey sky overhead. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and his expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Elena, you shouldn't be out here. It's cold." She climbed the steps and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Her breath came in visible puffs, and she was shivering, but she didn't move. Jessie shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. The garment smelled of horse and leather and wood smoke, scents that were somehow comforting. "I'm guessing you heard," he said. She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's all right. I've run out of towns before. I'll find another place, another job." He adjusted the guitar on his lap. "Though I have to admit, I've gotten kind of attached to Copper Ridge, more than I usually do." Elena reached out and grabbed his sleeve, gripping it tightly. She shook her head, the gesture almost violent in its intensity. "You don't want me to go?" She shook her head again, and now the tears did fall, tracking down her cheeks in the fading light. Jessie set the guitar aside carefully. "Elena, listen to me. I know what Samuel Garrett is doing. I know he's clearing the way to make some kind of claim on you, and I'm not going to stand by and let that happen without saying something." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head frantically, pointing toward town, toward danger. "I know it's risky. I know he's got power here that I don't, but there's got to be someone in this town who'll listen. Someone who cares about what's right more than what's convenient." Elena pulled a small piece of paper from her dress pocket, something she'd torn from the store ledger. On it, in careful letters, she had written one word: sheriff. Jessie took the paper, studying it. "You think the sheriff will help?" She shook her head, then pointed at the word again, and made a gesture like closing a door. Sheriff Morrison was closed to them, not an ally. "Then who?" Jessie asked. Elena pointed to the church, then to Jessie, then to herself. The three of them. That was all they had. Jessie looked at the church doors behind them, thinking Father Vincent had warned him, but the old priest had also been kind, and there was a difference between warning someone away from danger and refusing to help when danger arrived anyway. "All right," Jessie said. "Tomorrow I'll talk to Father Vincent, see if he knows anything that might help, or if he'd be willing to at least bear witness to what's happening. It's not much, but it's something." Elena squeezed his hand once gratefully, then stood to leave. Jessie caught her wrist gently. "Wait, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, whatever Samuel tries, you have a choice. You always have a choice. Don't let anyone tell you different." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had appeared in her life like an answered prayer she'd been too afraid to voice. Then she did something that surprised them both. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, a gesture of trust and connection that spoke louder than any words could have. When she pulled back, Jessie's eyes were bright. "Be safe," he said, "and if things get bad, you come find me. Day or night, I don't care. You come find me." Elena nodded and slipped away into the gathering darkness, Jessie's coat still around her shoulders. She would return it tomorrow, but tonight she needed the comfort of it, the reminder that someone saw her as worth protecting. Behind her, Jessie watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then he picked up his guitar and played into the empty night, the notes carrying a new edge of defiance. The next morning, Jessie found Father Vincent in the church garden, tending to the herbs that had gone scraggly with the changing season. The priest looked up as Jessie approached, his expression suggesting he'd been expecting this conversation. "Mr. Dalton, you're here early. Needed to talk to you, Father." "About Elena Garrett." Vincent straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement. "I wondered when we'd have this conversation. Come inside. It's warmer." They settled in the small office beside the sanctuary, surrounded by books and ledgers and the accumulated paperwork of parish life. Vincent poured 2 cups of weak coffee and handed one to Jessie. "How much do you know about Elena's situation?" Vincent asked. "Enough to know it's not right. Samuel Garrett is planning something, and everyone in this town is either too scared or too indifferent to stop him." "Not everyone is indifferent." Vincent's voice was quiet. "But fear is a powerful motivator. Samuel controls the economic lifeblood of this town. Cross him, and you lose your business, your home, your livelihood. Most people have families to think about. So, they just let him do whatever he wants? Not whatever he wants. There are limits, even here." Vincent sipped his coffee. "But Samuel is clever. He operates within the bounds of law, or close enough to them. He took Elena in after the fire, through proper channels. He pays the widow to house her. If he decides to marry her, it will be legal, with all the appropriate papers signed. Even though she can't consent? Can't speak for herself? Vincent's face tightened. That's the crux of it, isn't it? Without a voice, Elena has no legal standing to refuse. Samuel could argue, quite convincingly in a court of law, that as her closest living relative and financial guardian, he has the right to make decisions in her best interest. Jesse set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. That's not justice, Father. That's tyranny wrapped in legal language. I agree, but my agreement doesn't change the law. Vincent leaned forward. I've been documenting things. You should know. The way the widow treats her, the bruises I've seen on Elena's arms over the years, the fear in her eyes. I keep records, written testimony that might matter someday if the right people ask the right questions. Would you testify, if it came to that? Testify to whom? The sheriff is Samuel's hunting partner. The mayor owes him money. The judge in the county seat appointed by men Samuel helped elect. Vincent spread his hands. I'm not saying it's hopeless. I'm saying the system is designed to protect men like Samuel, not girls like Elena. Jesse stood and paced to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Then we work outside the system. Careful, son. That kind of talk leads to trouble you can't take back. What would you have me do? Walk away? Let her be trapped in a marriage that's really just sanctioned imprisonment? Vincent was quiet for a long moment. No, he finally said. No, I wouldn't have you walk away. I'd have you be smart, patient, strategic. Samuel is making his moves, but he hasn't made his final one yet. That gives us time. Time for what? To build a case that even this town can't ignore, to document everything, gather witnesses, find the cracks in Samuel's armor. Vincent stood as well. And to give Elena options, should she need them. I have connections with a convent in Santa Fe. They take in women who need sanctuary, no questions asked. It's not ideal, but it's better than the alternative. You'd help her escape? I'd help her choose her own path, whatever that might be. Vincent fixed Jesse with a steady gaze. The question is, would you help her and then let her go, even if her path doesn't include you? The question hit harder than Jesse expected. He realized he'd been thinking of Elena as someone to be saved, but not considering what came after, what she might want, independent of his own growing feelings. Yes, he said, though the word cost him. If that's what she needs, yes. Good. Then we have a chance. Vincent moved to his desk and pulled out a leather journal. This is 9 years of observations about Elena's treatment in the widow's house. It's not enough on its own, but it's a start. I'm trusting you with this because I believe you genuinely care about her welfare, not just about being the hero of this story. Jesse took the journal, feeling the weight of it. Thank you, Father. Don't thank me yet. We're going up against a powerful man in a town that's proven very good at looking the other way. It's going to take more than good intentions. As Jesse left the church journal hidden inside his shirt, he felt the shift that had occurred. This was no longer about playing music in a town for a few weeks before moving on. He had taken a side, made a commitment, and there would be consequences. Across the street, partially hidden by the shadow of the bank's awning, Martin Crawford watched him leave. Then he turned and climbed the stairs to Samuel Garrett's office. That afternoon, Samuel sat in his leather chair, fingers steepled, listening to Crawford's report with a face that revealed nothing. He was in there for nearly an hour, Crawford finished, and when he left, his coat hung different, like he was carrying something. The priest's journal, most likely, Samuel said calmly. Vincent has been keeping records for years. I've known about it. Crawford looked surprised. You have? Why not? Because a journal is just words on paper, Martin. It means nothing without someone willing to read it and act on it. And no one in this town will. Samuel stood and walked to his window, the same window from which he'd watched Elena so many times. But it does tell me that Mr. Dalton is more deeply involved than I anticipated. That changes things. What do you want me to do? Samuel turned, his expression hardening. It's time to accelerate our timeline. Send word to the widow that I'll be calling on Elena tomorrow evening, formally. Make sure the arrangements are proper, witnesses present if needed. I want everything documented. You're going to propose? I'm going to present her with a choice. Marry me. With all the security and respectability that entails, or continue as she is, dependent on the charity of others who are growing tired of the burden. Samuel smiled slightly. It's not really a choice at all, but it will appear to be one. That's what matters. And if she refuses, if she tries to indicate, she won't be able to. Samuel's voice was cold now, businesslike. I've thought this through very carefully, Martin, every detail accounted for. By this time tomorrow, Elena Garrett will be engaged to marry me, and there's nothing a drifting guitar player or an aging priest can do about it. After Crawford left, Samuel opened his desk drawer and removed a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, modest but respectable, purchased from a jeweler in the county seat 2 months ago. He had been planning this for some time, waiting for the right moment. The arrival of Jessie Dalton had forced his hand, but Samuel didn't mind. He preferred decisive action to prolonged uncertainty. That evening, Elena was sweeping the store when Widow Pritchard received Samuel's message. The widow's face transformed from its usual pinched disapproval to something almost gleeful. "Elena, come here, girl." Elena set down the broom and approached slowly. "Mr. Garrett will be calling tomorrow evening. He wishes to speak with you about your future." The widow reached out and straightened Elena's collar, an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. "You'll wear your Sunday dress. I'll fix your hair properly. This is a great honor, you understand. Most girls in your position would never receive such an opportunity." Elena's face drained of color. She shook her head, backing away. "Oh, don't start that. This is happening whether you like it or not. It's what's best for you, what your poor father would have wanted if he were alive to see it." The widow's voice hardened. "You'll present yourself well, and you'll accept his proposal with gratitude. Am I clear?" Elena turned and ran, not to her room but out the back door, into the cold November evening without a coat or shawl. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, ran until she found herself at the church garden where she and Jessie had first met. He was there, as if he'd known she would come, sitting on the garden wall with his guitar. When he saw her face, he was on his feet immediately. What happened? Elena couldn't explain with gestures alone. The panic, the trapped feeling, the sense of time running out was too big for simple movements. So she did the only thing she could. She grabbed Jessie's hand and pressed it over her heart, letting him feel how it raced, letting him understand through touch what she couldn't say with words. Jessie pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her shaking form. "It's all right," he said, though they both knew it wasn't. "We'll figure something out. I promise you, Elena. We'll figure something out." But even as he made the promise, he could feel the walls closing in, the weight of Samuel Garrett's power pressing down on them from all sides. And he wondered if this was a promise he could actually keep, or just another pretty lie told by a man who wanted to believe he could save someone when he hadn't been able to save anyone yet. The rain started just before midnight, cold drops that turned the street outside the livery stable into rivers of mud. Jessie sat in the hayloft where he'd been sleeping since losing his room at the boarding house, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at nothing. He couldn't stop thinking about the look on Elena's face earlier, the way her heart had hammered against his palm like a trapped bird. He'd sent her back to the store with Father Vincent, who had appeared in the garden as if summoned by some divine intervention. The priest had promised to stay with her, to not leave her alone with the widow tonight. But tomorrow was coming regardless, and Jessie had no plan that didn't end with him getting arrested or worse. The guitar sat beside him, and without thinking, he picked it up and began to play. Not one of his usual songs, but something older, something he hadn't touched in 5 years. The melody came haltingly at first, his fingers remembering what his mind had tried to forget. Her name had been Catherine Miller. Jesse had met her in a railroad town in Colorado, back when he still believed in futures and forevers. She'd been a schoolteacher, 24 years old, with auburn hair and a laugh that could light up a room. She'd come west from Boston to bring education to mining towns, full of idealism and purpose. He'd been working on the rail line then, driving spikes 12 hours a day under a sun that cooked men alive. But in the evenings, he played guitar at the saloon, and that's where Catherine had heard him. She'd stood in the doorway, too proper to enter but too curious to leave, and when their eyes met, something had shifted in his chest, like tectonic plates finding new alignment. Their courtship had been slow and careful. Catherine had a reputation to protect, and Jesse respected that. They'd walked together on Sunday afternoons, always in public view. He'd played music for her on her boarding house porch while her landlady watched from the window. They'd talked about books and dreams and the possibilities that existed in a country still young enough to be shaped. Jesse had started saving money, planning. He'd found a piece of land near Durango, nothing much but enough for a small house and maybe some horses. Catherine had seen it and smiled, and that smile had been worth every blister and backache the railroad had given him. But the mine owners had other plans. The workers had been organizing, talking about better wages and safer conditions. Jesse hadn't been involved directly, but he'd sympathized, and that had been enough. When the strike started, the owners brought in enforcers, hard men with guns and no conscience. They'd needed to make examples, to show what happened when people asked for too much. Catherine had been walking home from the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Wrong place, wrong time, caught in the crossfire when the enforcers opened up on a group of strikers. She'd been killed instantly, along with 2 miners and a shopkeeper's son. Jesse had been 3 streets away when he heard the shots. By the time he reached her, she was already gone, her schoolbooks scattered in the dust, her blood pooling beneath her like a terrible shadow. The town had called it a tragedy. The mine owners had expressed regret. The sheriff had arrested no one. And Jesse had learned a lesson that had burned itself into his bones. The powerful did what they wanted, and the rest of the world just cleaned up the mess. He'd buried Catherine in the town cemetery, next to the miners who died beside her. Then he'd packed his few belongings, strapped his guitar to his back, and started walking. He hadn't stopped for more than a few months anywhere since. The guitar fell silent in the hayloft. Jesse set it aside and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He'd promised himself after Catherine that he wouldn't care that deeply again, wouldn't put down roots, wouldn't let anyone matter enough to break him when they were taken away. But Elena mattered. Somehow, despite all his defenses, she'd gotten past them. Maybe it was her silence that called to his own, or the way music connected them without needing words. Maybe it was simply that he recognized suffering when he saw it, and couldn't walk past it anymore. Or maybe he was just tired of running. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like accusations. Jesse lay back in the hay and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories played behind his eyelids like a cruel theater show. Catherine's smile, the sound of gunfire, blood in the dust, the weight of a shovel in his hands as he dug her grave. And now, Elena, trapped in a different kind of violence, the slow suffocation of having no voice and no choice. If he walked away, she would disappear into Samuel Garrett's house, and the town would forget she'd ever been anything but his property. History would repeat itself, just as it always did when good people stayed silent. But if he stayed, if he fought, what could he actually accomplish? He had money, no standing, no leverage. Samuel controlled everything that mattered in Copper Ridge. The law, the economy, the social structure. Jesse was just a drifter with a guitar and a collection of scars he carried poorly. The one thing he had was the truth, and Father Vincent's journal documenting years of abuse. But truth without power was just noise, easily drowned out by men who controlled the narrative. Jesse sat up again, struck by a sudden thought. He grabbed his saddlebag and dug through it until he found what he was looking for. A letter, creased and faded, that he'd been carrying for 3 years. It was from a U.S. Marshal named William Thornton, a man Jesse had helped once in New Mexico when a gang of rustlers had taken over a small town. Thornton had given him the letter as a kind of open favor, telling Jesse that if he ever needed help, legal help, to send word. Jesse had never used it, never wanted to be beholden to anyone, but maybe now was the time. The problem was distance and timing. Santa Fe was a week's ride, minimum. Even if he sent a telegram, it would take days for a marshal to arrive, and Samuel's proposal was happening tomorrow night. By the time help came, if it came at all, it would be too late. Unless he could delay things somehow, throw sand in the gears, create obstacles that would buy them time. Jesse pulled out a piece of paper and began to write by the light of his failing lantern. The letter to Marshal Thornton was careful and factual, laying out the situation without hyperbole. He included details from Father Vincent's journal, dates and incidents that could be verified. He described Samuel's economic control over the town and the lack of local legal recourse. He asked not for a rescue, but for an investigation. When he finished, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Jesse sealed the letter and tucked it inside his coat. At first light, he'd ride to the county seat and send the telegram himself. It was a long shot, but it was something. As dawn broke grey and cold over Copper Ridge, Elena stood at her window, watching the rain-soaked streets. She hadn't slept either. The widow had locked her in her room after Father Vincent left, for her own protection, and Elena had spent the night sitting on her cot, mind racing through impossible scenarios. She could run, but where would she go? She had no money, no family, no skills that would earn her a living in another town. Samuel would find her eventually, and when he did, the consequences would be worse. She could refuse the proposal outright, but what power did her refusal actually hold? Samuel would simply frame it as the confusion of a damaged mind, someone who didn't know what was best for herself. The widow would agree, and the town would nod sympathetically at Samuel's patience in dealing with such a difficult situation. She could hurt herself, make herself unmarriageable, but that thought was too dark to follow to its conclusion. The only real option was the one Father Vincent had mentioned to Jesse, though Elena didn't know about it yet, the convent in Santa Fe. But even that required escape, travel, time they didn't have. Elena picked up the small hand mirror that sat on her dresser, one of the few personal items she owned. She studied her face in the watery morning light. 23 years old, but she barely recognized herself. When had she become this frightened creature, all nervous glances and hunched shoulders? She thought about the girl she'd been before the fire, the one who'd sung while she worked and wasn't afraid to meet people's eyes. That girl was still in there somewhere, buried under years of trauma and silence. Jesse had seen her somehow. He'd looked past the broken exterior and found something worth protecting. The question was whether she could find that girl too, resurrect her long enough to fight for her own life. A key turned in the lock. Elena set down the mirror as Widow Pritchard entered, carrying a basin of hot water and a bar of soap. Her expression was almost kind, which was somehow more unsettling than her usual harshness. "Time to make you presentable," the widow said. "Mr. Garrett will be here at 7 o'clock. That gives us all day to prepare." What followed was hours of uncomfortable transformation. The widow scrubbed Elena's skin until it was raw and pink, washed her hair with harsh soap, and combed through the tangles with brutal efficiency. She produced a dress that Elena had never seen before, dark blue with lace at the collar, clearly purchased for this occasion. "Mr. Garrett sent this," the widow explained as she laced Elena into the garment. "Wanted you to have something proper for the occasion. See how generous he is, how thoughtful." The dress fit perfectly, which meant Samuel had somehow obtained Elena's measurements. The thought made her skin crawl. How long had he been planning this? How many details had he arranged while she remained ignorant? By late afternoon, Elena barely recognized herself in the mirror. Her hair was styled in an elaborate arrangement of pins and curls. The dress transformed her shape into something more mature, more formal. The widow had even applied a touch of rouge to her cheeks and lips, making her look almost festive. "There," the widow said with satisfaction, "you look like a proper young lady. Your mother would be proud. God rest her soul." Elena doubted that very much. Her mother had been a quiet woman, worn down by years of hard farming and harder luck, but she'd had fire in her when it mattered. She'd once chased off a land agent with a shotgun when he tried to cheat them. Elena wondered what her mother would do in this situation, whether she'd fight or accept. But her mother was dead, and Elena was alone. At 6:30, Widow Pritchard led Elena downstairs to the store's small parlor, a room usually reserved for important customers. The widow had arranged flowers on the table and lit candles that cast warm, flickering light across the space. It looked like a stage set, everything carefully positioned to create an impression of domestic tranquility. "Now remember," the widow said, gripping Elena's shoulders, "be grateful, be humble, accept graciously. This is your chance at a real life, not this half-existence you've been living. Do you understand?" Elena said nothing, because what was there to say? At 7 o'clock precisely, Samuel Garrett arrived. He wore his finest suit, hair pomaded, boots polished to a mirror shine. He carried a small bouquet of hothouse flowers that must have cost a fortune to obtain in late November. Behind him came Martin Crawford, serving as witness, and Sheriff Morrison, whose presence added an official weight to the proceedings. "Miss Garrett," Samuel said with a slight bow. "You look lovely." The widow beamed. "Please, sit. I've prepared coffee." They arranged themselves around the small table like actors in a play. Samuel sat across from Elena, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. The sheriff and Crawford stood near the door, uncomfortable, but present. Samuel set the flowers on the table and then reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing the velvet box. He opened it to reveal the ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond. "Elena," he began, his voice formal and rehearsed, "you and I have known each other your entire life. I watched you grow up, and when tragedy struck your family, I considered it my duty to ensure you were cared for. Over these past years, I've come to realize that duty has transformed into something deeper, affection, even love of a kind." Elena's hands clenched in her lap, hidden by the table. "I'm prepared to offer you something no other man in this town will. Marriage, security, a home of your own. You'll want for nothing. You'll be respected as Mrs. Samuel Garrett." He leaned forward slightly. "All you need to do is accept. A simple nod will suffice." The room fell silent. Elena could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, each second loud as a hammer blow. Everyone was waiting, watching her face for that nod of acceptance. She thought about Catherine Miller, the woman Jesse had loved and lost. She thought about all the women throughout history who'd been forced into marriages they didn't want, their voices erased, their choices stolen. She thought about her father, who died trying to save his barn because it represented his independence, his refusal to be controlled. And she thought about Jesse, sitting in that hayloft right now, probably planning some desperate gesture that would only get him hurt. Elena stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, every eye in the room fixed on her. She walked to where her coat hung by the door and put it on, her movements deliberate and clear. "Elena," the widow's voice was sharp with shock, "what do you think you're doing?" Elena walked to the front door and opened it, letting in a gust of cold air. Then she turned back to look at Samuel, and for the first time in 18 years, she forced sound from her throat. It wasn't words, couldn't be words, but it was something. A low, guttural sound of refusal that came from somewhere deep and primal. Then she walked out into the night. The street was empty, rain-washed and gleaming in the lamplight. Elena's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She had no plan, no destination, but her feet carried her forward anyway, away from the store, away from Samuel's proposal, away from the life that had been decided for her. Behind her, she heard voices raised in confusion and anger, the widow shrieking, Samuel's voice cold and controlled, issuing orders, footsteps following her into the street. Elena began to run. She didn't know where she was going until she arrived. The livery stable, the hayloft, where she'd heard Jesse's guitar in the evenings. She climbed the ladder with shaking hands and found him there, already awake, already dressed, as if he'd been waiting for something to happen. Elena? He was on his feet immediately. What's wrong? What happened? She couldn't explain, couldn't make the gestures that would convey the enormity of what she'd just done. So she simply collapsed against him, her body shaking with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had said no. In her own way, with her own voice, she had finally said no. Jesse held her, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong. "It's all right," he murmured. "Whatever happened, we'll figure it out. You're safe here." But even as he said it, they heard the voices getting closer, saw the light of lanterns approaching the stable. Samuel had mobilized the town, and they were coming to retrieve what he considered his property. Jesse looked down at Elena, saw the determination in her eyes despite the fear, and made a decision. He grabbed his guitar case, his saddlebag, and Elena's hand. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded. "Then we're leaving. Right now." They descended from the loft and moved quickly to the stalls. Jesse saddled his horse with practiced efficiency while Elena watched the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. The voices were closer now, Sheriff Morrison calling for them to come out peacefully. Jesse helped Elena onto the horse, then mounted behind her. She felt the solid warmth of him at her back, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. For the first time in years, she felt something other than trapped. "Hold on," Jesse said quietly. Then he kicked the horse into motion, and they burst from the stable into the cold November night, riding hard toward the edge of town, and whatever uncertain future waited beyond it. Behind them, shouts erupted, and more lanterns flared to life, but Jesse didn't slow down. They were running now, both of them, toward or away from something neither could fully name. But they were running together, and that made all the difference. The horses' hooves threw up chunks of mud as they thundered past the last buildings of Copper Ridge and into the open country beyond. Elena clung to the saddle horn, feeling Jesse's chest against her back, his breath warm against her ear as he urged the horse faster. Behind them, the shouts faded but didn't disappear entirely. She could still see the bobbing lights of lanterns, hear the distant sound of other horses being saddled. Samuel wouldn't let her go easily. She represented too much to him. Control, possession, the ability to do whatever he wanted without consequence. "There's a creek about 3 miles north," Jesse called over the wind. "We'll follow it west, make it harder to track us in the dark." Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see the gesture. Her mind was spinning with the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd refused Samuel Garrett in front of witnesses. She'd walked out of the only home she'd known for 9 years. She'd chosen the unknown over the unbearable, and there was no taking it back now. The landscape rolled past in shadows and starlight. Montana stretched wide and indifferent around them, vast enough to swallow 2 people without trace if they knew where to go. Jessie seemed to know these lands better than she'd expected, navigating by instinct and the sparse light of a cloud-covered moon. When they reached the creek, Jessie slowed the horse and guided it into the shallow water. The animal protested slightly, huffing at the cold, but Jessie's steady hand on the reins kept it moving. They traveled upstream for nearly a mile, water splashing against the horse's legs, before Jessie finally directed them back onto dry ground. He dismounted first, then helped Elena down. Her legs were shaking, partly from cold, partly from the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Jesse studied her face in the darkness, his hands steadying her shoulders. "You all right?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. "We can't stop long. They'll figure out the creek trick eventually, but it'll buy us some time." He glanced back the way they'd come, seeing no lights yet, but knowing they were there. There's an old line shack about 2 hours from here, used to be part of a cattle operation that went under. We can rest there, figure out our next move. Elena wanted to ask what the next move could possibly be. They had one horse, minimal supplies, and the most powerful man in the region hunting them. But she had no voice for the questions, so she simply nodded again and let Jessie help her back onto the horse. They rode in silence after that, Jessie keeping to terrain that offered cover. Gullies, stands of pine, the shadows of rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. The temperature dropped as the night deepened, and Elena found herself pressing back against Jessie's warmth, grateful for the solid presence of him. She thought about the moment in the parlor when she'd forced that sound from her throat. It hadn't been words, hadn't been anything close to articulate speech, but it had been hers. For 18 years, she'd been silent, letting others speak for her, decide for her, define her. That single sound of refusal had been the most honest thing she'd expressed since the fire. The line shack appeared suddenly out of the darkness, a small structure with sagging walls and a roof that had seen better days. Jessie dismounted and checked inside first, making sure it was empty of wildlife or squatters before helping Elena down. Inside, the shack was bare except for an old iron stove and a few pieces of broken furniture. But it had walls and a roof, and after the cold ride, that was enough. Jessie unsaddled the horse and tied it under a lean-to attached to the shack, then returned with his saddlebag and guitar case. He worked quickly, gathering broken wood from around the shack and starting a small fire in the stove. The flames caught and grew, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Elena sat on the floor near the stove, holding her hands toward the warmth, watching Jessie move with practiced efficiency. When he finally sat down beside her, the tension in his shoulders was visible. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to understand that I should have told you earlier." Elena turned to face him, waiting. 5 years ago, I was engaged to be married. Her name was Catherine. Jessie's voice was low, steady, but Elena could hear the pain underneath. She was killed in a labor dispute, caught in crossfire between mine workers and the enforcers the owners brought in. She'd done nothing wrong, was just walking home from teaching school. But she died anyway, because powerful men decided other people's lives didn't matter. He paused, staring into the fire. After she died, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't get attached again, wouldn't stay anywhere long enough to care, because caring meant pain, and I'd had enough pain to last a lifetime. He looked at Elena then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. But then I met you, and somehow you got past all those walls I'd built. And now here we are, running from another powerful man who thinks he can take whatever he wants. Elena reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. She understood what he was telling her, that he was scared, that this mattered, that he was choosing to care despite knowing what it might cost. "The thing is," Jessie continued, "I sent a telegram this morning to a U.S. Marshal I know in Santa Fe. Asked him to investigate Samuel Garrett, the situation in Copper Ridge. But that help is days away, maybe a week, so we need to decide what we're doing until then. We can keep running, try to get you somewhere safe and wait it out, or—" He trailed off, but Elena understood the unspoken option. They could go back and fight, not with guns or violence, but with truth, with witnesses, with whatever leverage they could create. Elena stood and moved to where Jessie's saddlebag lay. She dug through it until she found a stub of pencil and an old receipt, then brought them back to the fire. By the flickering light she wrote carefully, "Father Vincent's journal." Jessie's eyes widened with understanding. "You know about that?" She nodded, then wrote more. "Others must know too. You mean there are other people in town who've seen what Samuel does, who might testify if they felt safe enough?" Elena nodded emphatically. She thought of the women at the market, the way they'd pulled their children closer when she passed. They hadn't been afraid of her. They'd been afraid of acknowledging what was happening to her. afraid of what that acknowledgement might cost them. But fear could break if enough people stood together. If one person spoke up, maybe others would find their courage. It was a fragile hope, but it was something. Jessie studied the words she'd written, then looked back at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You want to go back?" It wasn't a question, but Elena nodded anyway. Then she wrote one more thing. "Not running anymore. It's going to be dangerous. Samuel won't take this lying down. He'll paint you as unstable, me as a criminal. He'll use every bit of power he has to discredit us." Elena knew all of that. But she also knew that running would mean spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, always afraid, always hiding. The fire had taken her voice, but she'd let fear take everything else. She was done giving pieces of herself away to make other people comfortable. She met Jesse's eyes and held his gaze, letting him see the determination there. After a long moment, he smiled slightly. "All right then. We go back. But we do it smart, with a plan." They spent the next hour working out the details. Jesse would ride into town alone at dawn, go straight to Father Vincent and present the journal publicly, not to the sheriff who was compromised, but in the church during morning service when the whole town would be gathered. Force them to see, to hear, to make a choice about what kind of community they wanted to be. Meanwhile, Elena would stay hidden at the shack. If things went wrong, if Samuel managed to arrest Jesse or worse, she would ride to the county seat and find help there. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it gave them options. As the fire burned low and exhaustion finally caught up with them, Jesse gave Elena his coat for a pillow and settled against the wall with his guitar. "Try to sleep," he said. "It's going to be a long day tomorrow." But Elena didn't sleep. Instead, she watched the dying fire and thought about her father, about the night he'd run into the burning barn trying to save the horses. Everyone had called it foolish, said he should have let them go, that animals weren't worth a human life. But her father had believed that what you protected said something about who you were, that standing by while things burned made you complicit in the destruction. He hadn't saved the horses. The barn had collapsed before he could get them out, and he'd been trapped in the flames. But Elena had never thought his choice was wrong. He'd died trying to do something right in a world that too often chose convenience over courage. Now it was her turn to run into the fire, metaphorically speaking, to stand up in front of the town that had ignored her suffering and demand to be seen. Not as broken, not as damaged, but as someone who'd survived and was still fighting. Dawn came cold and clear, frost glittering on the grass outside the shack. Jesse saddled the horse and checked his supplies, moving with the calm focus of someone preparing for battle. Elena stood in the doorway watching him, wishing she had words to tell him what his belief in her had meant, how it had helped her remember who she used to be. Before he mounted, Jesse came back to where she stood. He cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms warm against her skin. "When this is over," he said quietly, "however it ends, I want you to know something. You're the bravest person I've ever met. Catherine was brave too, but she never had to fight for her right to exist the way you have. You've been fighting your whole life, even when no one noticed." "I notice. I see you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat strong and steady, then pointed to her own heart. The gesture said what words couldn't. "I see you too." Jessie kissed her forehead. A gentle press of lips felt like a promise, then mounted the horse. "Stay hidden until you see riders leave town heading this direction. If they're coming for me, you'll have a few hours to get to the county seat. There's money in the saddlebag, enough to hire a lawyer if needed." Elena nodded, committing the instructions to memory. "And Elena, whatever happens, don't come back for me. Promise me that. Get yourself somewhere safe and stay there." She made no such promise. They both knew she wouldn't keep it anyway. Jesse turned the horse and rode toward Copper Ridge as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Elena watched until he disappeared from view, then returned to the shack and began her own preparations. She might not have a voice, but she had her father's stubbornness and her mother's fire. If Jessie needed help, she would be ready. In Copper Ridge, Samuel Garrett had not slept. He'd spent the night in his office, consuming coffee and rage in equal measures. Elena's rejection had been public, witnessed, humiliating. The town was already buzzing with gossip, people wondering what had caused the normally compliant girl to suddenly flee. Samuel had sent men after them, of course, but they'd lost the trail at the creek. Now, as dawn approached, he was planning his next move. He couldn't let this stand. His authority, his reputation, everything he'd built in this town depended on maintaining control. Sheriff Morrison sat across from him, looking tired and uncomfortable. "We'll find them, Samuel. They can't have gone far on one horse." "I don't want them found together," Samuel said coldly. "I want the drifter arrested for kidnapping. I want Elena brought back and declared mentally unfit to make her own decisions. I want this situation resolved in a way that makes me look like the victim, not the villain. People are asking questions about how you treat her, about why she ran." Morrison shifted in his seat. "Father Vincent has been talking to folks, suggesting maybe Elena had reasons." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Then perhaps it's time Father Vincent learned that even priests can be replaced. The diocese doesn't need troublemakers stirring up their congregations. You'd go after a priest? I'll do whatever is necessary to maintain order in my town." Samuel stood and moved to the window. The street below was starting to wake up, shopkeepers opening their doors, the faithful heading toward the church for early morning service. "Get your men together. I want Elena found by noon, and I want the drifter in jail by tonight, whatever it takes." Morrison hesitated, then nodded and left. Samuel continued staring out the window, his mind working through contingencies and consequences. He'd built his empire carefully over the years, brick by brick, debt by debt. He wouldn't let it crumble because of one mute girl and a guitar-playing nobody. But as the church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to service, Samuel felt the first flicker of genuine unease. Something was shifting in Copper Ridge, some current he couldn't quite identify. The town felt different this morning, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. He shook off the feeling and reached for his coat. Time to make his own appearance at church, to play the wronged guardian, concerned for his ward's safety. The congregation would see him as the stable, responsible one, and Elena as the confused girl who'd been led astray. It was a good story. Samuel had always been good at stories, but as he descended the stairs and stepped onto Main Street, heading toward the church, he didn't see the rider approaching from the north. He didn't see Jessie Dalton, still on horseback, carrying Father Vincent's journal like a weapon. And he didn't see the determination in Jessie's eyes, the look of a man who'd finally decided that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight was already lost. The pieces were moving into position. By the time the church bell finished ringing, everything in Copper Ridge would be different. The question was whether that difference would be for better or worse, and who would still be standing when the dust finally settled. The church was nearly full when Jessie arrived, tying his horse to the rail outside with hands that were steadier than he expected. Through the open doors, he could hear the congregation singing the opening hymn, their voices rising in practiced harmony. Father Vincent stood at the front, leading the service, unaware of what was about to happen. Jessie tucked the journal inside his coat and climbed the steps. Several people turned as he entered, their voices faltering mid-verse. Widow Pritchard sat in the third pew, her face pinched with exhaustion and anger. Sheriff Morrison stood near the back, arms crossed, clearly posted there to watch for Elena's return. And there, in the front pew reserved for prominent citizens, sat Samuel Garrett, looking perfectly composed in his Sunday finest. Jessie walked down the center aisle as the hymn stuttered to a halt. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of his boots against the wooden floor. Father Vincent's eyes widened with a mixture of alarm and understanding. "Mr. Dalton," the priest said carefully, "this is unexpected. I apologize for the interruption, Father. Jesse's voice carried clearly through the sanctuary. But there's something this congregation needs to hear, and it can't wait until after services. Samuel rose from his pew, his expression arranging itself into concern. This man kidnapped my ward last night. Sheriff, arrest him. Morrison moved forward, but Jesse held up a hand. I didn't kidnap anyone. Elena Garrett left of her own free will after refusing Mr. Garrett's proposal. There were witnesses. He looked directly at Widow Pritchard. You were there. Tell them what happened. The widow's face flushed. She ran off like a mad thing. Ungrateful girl. After everything we've done for her. After everything you've done to her, you mean? Jesse pulled the journal from his coat and held it up. This is Father Vincent's record. 9 years of documented abuse. Beatings, starvation, verbal cruelty, all inflicted on a girl who had no voice to defend herself. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Father Vincent stepped forward, his face grave. Jesse, I gave you that in confidence. I know, Father, and I'm sorry. But confidence is what's kept Elena trapped all these years. Everyone in this town knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to say it out loud because speaking up might cost them. Jesse turned to face the congregation. Well, I'm saying it now. Samuel Garrett has been planning to force Elena into marriage, not because he loves her, but because she can't refuse him, because her silence makes her the perfect victim. These are serious accusations, Samuel said, his voice cold, based on the fantasies written by an elderly priest and the word of a drifter with no standing in this community. Sheriff, I insist you arrest this man for defamation and kidnapping. But Morrison didn't move immediately. He was looking at the journal in Jesse's hands with an expression that suggested he'd suspected some of this all along. Jesse opened the journal and began to read. March 15th, 1899. Elena came to confession with rope burns on her wrists. When I asked about them, she wrote that Mrs. Pritchard had tied her to the stove as punishment for burning breakfast. She was 14 years old. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Several women exchanged glances. August 2nd, 1902. Elena fainted during service. Doctor. Brennan examined her and found she hadn't eaten in 3 days. Mrs. Pritchard claimed Elena was fasting for spiritual reasons. Elena's written response said she'd been denied food as punishment for not working fast enough. Jesse continued reading, entry after entry, a relentless catalogue of cruelty disguised as discipline. With each entry, the atmosphere in the church grew heavier. People who had passed Elena in the street, who had seen her bruises and looked away, now had to confront exactly what their silence had enabled. Widow Pritchard stood abruptly. These are lies. That girl needed discipline. She was wild, troubled. I gave her structure, purpose. If I was sometimes harsh, it was for her own good. You beat her. Father Vincent's voice cut through the church like a blade. You starved her. You broke her spirit systematically over 9 years, and I documented it all because I prayed someone would eventually listen. He turned to the congregation. I am guilty too. I watched and wrote instead of acting. I told myself I was gathering evidence, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of Mrs. Pritchard's influence, afraid of Mr. Garrett's power. I let fear make me complicit. Samuel's composure was beginning to crack. This is absurd. I took Elena in out of family duty. I provided for her care. If Mrs. Pritchard was overzealous in her methods, I was unaware. I cannot be held responsible for. You paid Mrs. Pritchard reduced rent in exchange for keeping Elena, Jesse interrupted. You checked on her regularly. You knew exactly what was happening in that house, and you allowed it because it served your purposes. You wanted her broken enough that when you finally offered marriage, she'd be too beaten down to refuse. Prove it, Samuel snapped. You have nothing but speculation and the biased observations of a priest who clearly has his own agenda. Then let's ask Elena herself. The voice came from the back of the church, and every head turned. Elena stood in the doorway, wrapped in Jesse's coat, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted and terrified, but she walked forward with her chin raised, each step deliberate. Jessie's heart lurched. "Elena, I told you to stay hidden." She shook her head and continued walking until she stood in front of the congregation, facing them all. Then she reached into the coat pocket and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in careful handwriting. She'd spent the morning at the line shack writing everything she couldn't say, preparing for this moment. She handed the papers to Father Vincent, who looked at them and then at her with tears in his eyes. "You want me to read these?" Elena nodded. The priest cleared his throat and began. "My name is Elena Garrett. I haven't spoken since the night my father died, in the fire that took our barn. The doctors found no physical reason for my silence. They said it was trauma, that my voice might return with time. It never did." The church was utterly still as Father Vincent continued reading Elena's words, her accounting of 9 years under Widow Pritchard's roof. She wrote of being beaten with wooden spoons and leather straps, of sleeping on a cot without blankets in winter, of eating scraps and stale bread while the widow dined on fresh meat, of the casual cruelties that accumulated like water on stone, wearing her down until she'd almost forgotten she was human. And she wrote about Samuel, about the way he'd watched her over the years, his attention shifting from distant oversight to something hungry, about his visits to the store, the way his eyes lingered on her body, the casual touches that lasted too long, about the conversation she'd overheard 2 months ago when he told the widow to keep her presentable because he had plans. "I did not run away because I am ungrateful," Father Vincent read, his voice thick with emotion. "I ran because staying meant disappearing completely, becoming nothing more than property to be owned and controlled. I ran because even though I have no voice, I still have a choice, and I choose to be seen as a person, not as someone's burden or possession." When the priest finished, the silence was absolute. Elena stood before them all, exposed and vulnerable, but no longer invisible. She met Samuel's gaze directly, and for the first time she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before: uncertainty. An older woman in the 5th pew stood slowly. Her name was Clara Brennan, wife of the town doctor, and she'd been part of Copper Ridge Society for 30 years. "I saw the bruises," she said quietly. "Every Sunday when Elena came to church, I saw them and told myself it was none of my business. I was wrong." Another woman stood. "I pulled my daughter away from her once because I was afraid, not of Elena, but of acknowledging what was happening to her. Because if I acknowledged it, I'd have to do something, and doing something might cost me." Tears streaked her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." One by one, others stood. Men who'd looked away, women who'd whispered but never acted. The congregation was rising, a wave of collective guilt and recognition that their silence had enabled this. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his face troubled. "Mr. Garrett, I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Miss Elena and about whether there's been any impropriety in your guardianship." "This is a witch hunt," Samuel said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "You're taking the word of a mute girl who can barely function, a drifter with no ties to this community, and a priest who has clearly overstepped his bounds. None of this would hold up in any court of law." "Maybe not," came a new voice from the doorway. A man stepped into the church, tall and lean, wearing a marshal's badge that caught the morning light. "But I'd sure like to hear more about it." Jessie's breath caught. Marshal William Thornton had arrived far sooner than expected, probably riding through the night after receiving the telegram. The marshal walked down the aisle, taking in the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Got a wire yesterday from an old friend asking me to look into some irregularities in Copper Ridge," Thornton said. "Decided it warranted immediate attention." He looked at Samuel. "You must be Mr. Garrett. We need to talk. Official capacity." Samuel's face had gone pale. "I haven't done anything illegal. Everything I've done has been within the bounds of the law." "That may be true," Thornton agreed. But the law isn't just about what's legal, it's about what's right. And from what I'm hearing, there's a lot that ain't been right in this town. He turned to Elena. Miss, I understand you can't speak, but if you can write, I'd like your full statement. Everything that's happened, dates and details. Elena nodded eagerly. And I'll need to speak with Mrs. Pritchard, Father Vincent, and anyone else who has information relevant to this matter. Thornton's gaze swept the congregation. I'm also going to be looking into Mr. Garrett's business dealings. Sometimes when you pull on one thread, the whole tapestry unravels. Samuel's expression shifted from uncertainty to cold fury. You have no jurisdiction here, Marshal. This is a local matter. Actually, the moment you tried to force a woman into marriage against her will, you crossed a line. And when you used your economic power to silence witnesses and control the local law enforcement, you crossed another one. Thornton smiled, but it wasn't friendly. I've got all the jurisdiction I need. Now, you can come with me peacefully and answer some questions, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice. For a long moment, Samuel looked like he might fight. His eyes darted around the church, calculating odds, looking for allies. But the faces staring back at him held no support, only disgust, shame and anger at having been complicit in his actions. Finally, Samuel straightened his shoulders and walked toward the door with as much dignity as he could muster. This isn't over, he said quietly as he passed Jessie. You've made a powerful enemy. No, Jessie replied. I've just stopped pretending you were anything else. After Samuel and the marshal left, followed by Sheriff Morrison, the congregation remained standing. Father Vincent looked out at his flock, his face showing every one of his 60-plus years. I need to resign my position, he said. I failed in my most basic duty to protect the vulnerable. I documented suffering but didn't stop it. I don't deserve to stand in this pulpit. No, Father, Clara Brennan said firmly. You documented the truth when the rest of us wouldn't even look at it. You gave Elena and Mr. Dalton the evidence they needed to speak up. You made mistakes, but you also made possible what happened here today. Others murmured agreement. The mood in the church was complex, a mixture of shame, relief, and tentative hope. They had been forced to see themselves clearly, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Elena moved to where Jessie stood and took his hand. He squeezed gently, and she leaned against him, exhausted by the emotional weight of the morning. She'd been seen. After 18 years of invisibility, of being treated as less than fully human, she stood before her community and made them acknowledge her existence. Widow Pritchard sat hunched in her pew, suddenly small and old. I only did what I thought was right, she whispered, though no one was listening. I was trying to help. You were trying to control, Clara Brennan said, not unkindly. There's a difference. Father Vincent approached Elena and Jessie. There's a room at the rectory, he said, clean, comfortable, with a real bed and a lock on the door. You're both welcome to stay as long as you need. No obligations, no strings. Elena wrote quickly on a scrap of paper, Thank you. The congregation began to disperse, people filing out with their thoughts and guilt and questions about what came next. Some paused to speak quietly to Elena, offering apologies or simply touching her shoulder in acknowledgement. Others left without a word, too ashamed or too stubborn to admit their failures. As the church emptied, Jessie and Elena remained standing together in the silence that followed. They'd done it. They'd forced the truth into the light. And while the consequences were still unfolding, at least the lying was over. You were supposed to stay hidden, Jessie said softly. You could have been safe. Elena shook her head and wrote, Safe is not the same as free. Jessie read the words and smiled, genuine warmth breaking through the exhaustion on his face. No, I suppose it's not. They walked out of the church together into the bright Montana morning. The town looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything had changed. The silence that had protected Samuel Garrett's power had been shattered, and in its place was the messy, uncomfortable work of rebuilding a community on more honest foundations. It wouldn't be easy. There would be legal proceedings, social upheaval, and the hard task of figuring out how to move forward. But for the first time in 9 years, Elena Garrett walked through Copper Ridge with her head high, holding the hand of someone who saw her as fully human. And that was enough to start with. 3 months had passed since the morning Elena stood before the congregation, and Copper Ridge had transformed in ways both visible and hidden. The winter snows had come and gone, leaving behind the first tentative signs of spring mud and green shoots pushing through the thawed earth like promises the land was determined to keep. Marshall Thornton's investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected. Samuel Garrett's financial empire, so carefully constructed over 2 decades, had been built on predatory lending practices and manipulated contracts. Dozens of families discovered they'd been paying inflated interest rates, their debts extended through deliberate miscalculations that kept them perpetually indebted. The marshal had brought in a territorial accountant who spent weeks untangling the web of deceit. Samuel himself had fled before formal charges could be filed, disappearing one night with whatever liquid assets he could carry. Rumor placed him in San Francisco or maybe Denver, cities large enough to swallow a man who wanted to disappear. His bank had been seized by territorial authorities and a new manager appointed to restructure the legitimate debts and forgive those built on fraud. Widow Pritchard had faced her own reckoning. The church council had voted to remove her as caretaker of the general store, which was actually owned by the congregation as a charitable enterprise. She'd been allowed to keep her personal possessions, but had moved to live with a sister in Billings, her reputation in Copper Ridge destroyed beyond repair. The store now operated under community management, with profits divided among several families who'd lost income during Samuel's reign. Father Vincent had not resigned, though he'd offered repeatedly. Instead, the congregation had held a meeting and voted overwhelmingly for him to stay, recognizing that acknowledging failure was different from being consumed by it. The priest had aged visibly in these months, the weight of his guilt evident in new lines around his eyes, but he threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. His Sunday sermons focused less on obedience and more on courage, less on suffering in silence and more on speaking truth to power. Elena had spent those first weeks in the rectory, recovering physically and emotionally from 9 years of systematic abuse. Clara Brennan had taken it upon herself to ensure Elena received proper medical care, bringing her husband to examine the old injuries and current ailments. Dr. Brennan had found evidence of repeated beatings, malnutrition, and chronic stress that had taken a severe toll on her young body. He'd prescribed rest, regular meals, and gentle exercise, treating her with the professional care she'd been denied for years. But physical healing was only part of the process. Clara had also arranged for Elena to meet with a woman named Margaret Rose, a teacher from the county seat who specialized in helping trauma survivors find new ways to communicate. Margaret worked with Elena 3 times a week, teaching her sign language and helping her develop a more sophisticated system of written communication. Together, they explored whether Elena's voice might return with therapy or if her silence had become a permanent condition. The answer was uncertain. Elena discovered she could make sounds, humming, gasping, even occasional vowel sounds when she felt safe, but words remained locked somewhere beyond her reach. Margaret suggested the trauma had created a psychological barrier that might never fully dissolve. But she also emphasized that Elena's worth wasn't dependent on her ability to speak, that she was complete and whole exactly as she was. Jessie had stayed in Copper Ridge, taking up residence in a small cabin on the edge of town that had belonged to one of Samuel's foreclosed properties. The territorial government had allowed him to homestead it in exchange for maintaining the structure. He continued working, picking up jobs at the livery, the feed store, helping with construction projects that sprouted up as the town rebuilt itself economically. He still played guitar most evenings, now from the porch of his cabin, where people could gather if they wanted music or simply sit in companionable silence. The character of these gatherings had changed. Before, Jesse had been entertainment, a curiosity. Now he was a member of the community, someone who'd proven willing to risk everything for what was right. Elena attended these evening concerts regularly, often bringing fresh bread she'd learned to bake with Clara's patient instruction. She'd discovered she had a talent for cooking, and Clara had encouraged her to develop it, seeing it as both practical skill and creative outlet. Elena found peace in the rhythmic work of kneading dough, the alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into something nourishing and beautiful. On this particular evening in early April, Elena sat on Jesse's porch steps with her usual spot beside him, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of copper and violet. A small crowd had gathered, families mostly, and Jesse had just finished playing a lively reel that had the children dancing in the yard. As the applause faded, Jesse set down his guitar and pulled an envelope from his shirt pocket. "Got a letter today," he announced. "From the territorial governor's office." The crowd quieted, curious. Official correspondence was rare and usually significant. Jesse opened the envelope and read aloud, "Dear Mr. Dalton and Miss Garrett, it has come to our attention that your actions in exposing corruption in Copper Ridge have served the broader interests of justice in Montana Territory. We wish to formally commend your courage and offer assistance in your continued integration into the community." He looked up, a slight smile playing at his lips. "They're offering Elena a settlement from Samuel's seized assets. Not a fortune, but enough to provide financial independence. And they're issuing me a formal pardon for any charges of kidnapping or interference that might have been filed." Elena's eyes widened. She pulled out the small chalkboard she now carried everywhere and wrote quickly, "How much?" Jesse showed her the number. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to buy property, start a business, or simply live without depending on anyone's charity. Clara Brennan, sitting in the front row, smiled. "That's wonderful news. What will you do with it, Elena?" Elena's chalk moved across the board in careful letters. "Not sure yet, need to think." Over the following weeks, Elena did think. She thought about what kind of life she wanted to build, what would bring her purpose and joy. She'd spent so many years surviving that the concept of thriving felt foreign, almost dangerous, as if wanting too much might curse her to lose everything again. She talked with Clara about possibly opening a bakery, and Clara encouraged the idea enthusiastically. She discussed with Father Vincent the possibility of creating a sanctuary for other women in situations like hers had been, though the logistics felt overwhelming. She even approached Jesse tentatively about the future, writing questions she'd been afraid to ask. "Do you plan to stay in Copper Ridge?" They were sitting on his porch one evening after the crowd had dispersed, the stars emerging one by one overhead. Jesse considered the question carefully before answering. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "For 5 years, I've been running from ghosts, telling myself I was free because I had no ties. But I've learned something here. Freedom isn't about having no connections. It's about choosing which connections matter and fighting to protect them." He turned to face her directly. "I want to stay, Elena. I want to build something here, put down roots, become part of a community instead of just passing through. But I'll only stay if that's what you want too. I won't trap you with my presence or make you feel obligated because of what happened between us." Elena's throat tightened with emotion. She wrote carefully, "I want you to stay." She paused, then added, "I want to build something together." Jesse's face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his usually serious features. "Together sounds good." They began making plans. Elena would use part of her settlement to purchase a property on Main Street with space for a bakery on the ground floor and living quarters above. Jesse would help with the construction and renovation, using skills he'd picked up during his years of drifting work. It wouldn't be a grand establishment, but it would be theirs, built with their own hands and vision. The bakery opened in late June, on a morning when the mountain air was crisp and the sky impossibly blue. Elena had spent the previous night baking, filling the shop with loaves of bread, fruit pies, cinnamon rolls, and delicate pastries she'd perfected through months of practice. The smell alone drew a crowd before the doors officially opened. Clara had helped Elena create a sign for the window. Silent oven, fresh bread daily, Proprietor E. Garrett. Below it, a smaller note explained that the owner was mute but could communicate through writing, and that all customers were welcome regardless of their past silence or complicity. It was a gentle message of forgiveness paired with accountability. The first customer was Father Vincent, who purchased a loaf of sourdough and left a generous tip. "You've found your voice after all," he said, gesturing to the beautiful bread. "Just not the one any of us expected." Throughout the morning, a steady stream of townspeople came through. Some were simply curious, others genuinely supportive, and a few came to offer quiet apologies for their years of looking away. Elena accepted them all with grace, her hands flying across her chalkboard as she took orders and answered questions. Jessie worked beside her, handling the till and the heavier tasks, their partnership smooth and natural. They'd developed their own language over the months, a combination of signs, gestures, and shared understanding that needed few words. Watching them work together, customers remarked on how well matched they seemed, how their different wounds had somehow created complementary strengths. By afternoon, the initial inventory was nearly sold out. Elena leaned against the counter, exhausted but glowing with accomplishment. She'd done this. She'd taken her pain and her silence and transformed them into something productive, something that nourished others. The bakery represented more than just a business. It was proof that survival could evolve into creation, that victims could become builders. As the sun began to set and they prepared to close for the day, Jessie pulled Elena aside. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small wooden box, handcrafted and smooth with oil. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a simple silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a songbird, wings spread in flight. "I had the silversmith make it," Jessie explained. "I know you can't sing with your voice, but you sing with everything else. Your cooking, your kindness, the way you've forgiven this town, even though it didn't deserve forgiveness. That's a song worth celebrating." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she lifted the necklace from the box. Jessie fastened it around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. She touched the pendant, feeling its weight, its solid presence against her chest. Then she turned and wrapped her arms around him, holding tight. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who'd found each other in the midst of their respective storms. Jessie's lips brushed her temple, a gesture that had become familiar over the months, affectionate without demanding more than she was ready to give. When they finally pulled apart, Elena picked up her chalkboard and wrote, "Thank you for seeing me, for staying, for everything." "Thank you for letting me," Jessie replied. That evening, they didn't host the usual concert. Instead, they invited a smaller group to the apartment above the bakery for a quiet celebration. Clara and Dr. Brennan came, bringing wine and congratulations. Father Vincent arrived with a blessing for the new business. A few other friends from town joined, people who'd proven themselves trustworthy in the months since Samuel's fall. As the evening wore on and conversation flowed, Elena found herself standing by the window, looking out at Copper Ridge spread below. The town looked peaceful in the gathering darkness, lamplight glowing in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. It was the same view she'd had from the general store, but everything felt different now. She was no longer trapped, no longer invisible, no longer at the mercy of others' decisions about her worth and future. She had a business, a home, friendships, and someone who loved her, not despite her silence, but including it, as part of the complete person she was. Clara joined her at the window, following her gaze. "You've come so far," the older woman said softly. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Elena nodded, then picked up her slate and wrote, "Still scared sometimes." "Of course you are. Trauma doesn't just disappear because circumstances improve, but you're healing, Elena. Day by day, choice by choice. That's all any of us can do. Elena considered this, then wrote, "Thank you for standing up. That day in church. It mattered." Clara's eyes glistened. "I should have stood up years earlier. We all should have. But I'm grateful we finally found the courage, even if it took your bravery to show us how." As the party continued behind them, Jesse appeared at Elena's side, guitar in hand. "Feel like playing something?" he asked. Elena nodded eagerly. They'd developed a repertoire over the months, songs where Jesse played and sang while Elena hummed harmonies, their voices, one spoken and one wordless, weaving together in patterns that felt right. Jesse began to play, and Elena closed her eyes, letting the melody fill her. She hummed along, her voice stronger now than it had been that first day in the church garden. The sound was still wordless, still broken in its way, but it was hers. Her song, her choice, her expression of a self that had refused to be completely erased. The guests grew quiet, listening to the music that filled the small apartment. It was beautiful in an unconventional way, imperfect but honest, much like the community that was slowly learning to be better than it had been. When the song ended, Father Vincent raised his glass. "To Elena and Jesse," he said. "May you continue to remind us all that redemption is possible, that courage can be found even in the darkest places, and that the most powerful voice is the one that refuses to be silenced, regardless of the form it takes." Everyone drank to that, and Elena felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the wine. She was home. Not in a place, but in a life she'd chosen, surrounded by people who saw her clearly and valued her completely. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the apartment had grown quiet, Elena and Jesse sat together on the small balcony overlooking Main Street. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Jesse played his guitar softly, improvising melodies that matched the peaceful mood. Elena leaned against his shoulder, feeling the vibration of the music through his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid warmth of his presence. She thought about her father, wondered what he would think of the life she'd built from the ashes of that terrible fire. She thought about her mother, who died of fever when Elena was so young, leaving her vulnerable to circumstances no child should face. She thought about the girl she'd been at 5 years old, voice strong and future bright, before trauma had rewritten her story. That girl was gone, and mourning her felt appropriate. But Elena was beginning to understand that she didn't need to resurrect who she'd been before. She could be who she was now, silence and strength, scars and resilience, fear and courage, all mixed together into something complex and real. Jesse's music shifted into something familiar, her father's old song, the one they'd played together in the church garden all those months ago. Elena began to hum along, and their voices found each other in the darkness, creating something new from something old. Below them, Copper Ridge slept, a town still healing from its own wounds, still learning to be the community it claimed to be. There would be setbacks and struggles ahead. Not everyone had embraced the changes, and some resentment lingered toward Elena and Jesse for forcing uncomfortable truths into the light. But there would also be growth, slow and imperfect, as people learned to value courage over convenience, justice over comfort. The bakery would serve as a daily reminder that the vulnerable could become strong, that the silenced could still speak through their actions, that redemption was available to those willing to acknowledge their failures and work towards something better. As the song faded into the night air, Jesse set down his guitar and took Elena's hand. "I love you," he said simply. "Your silence, your strength, your stubborn refusal to give up. All of it." Elena couldn't say the words back, but she didn't need to. She squeezed his hand, leaned up, and kissed him gently, letting her actions speak what her voice could not. When they pulled apart, she picked up her slate one more time and wrote in the moonlight, "I love you too. Thank you for teaching me. I was worth loving." Jessie read the words, then pulled her close, and they sat like that as the stars wheeled overhead, two survivors who'd found each other and chosen to build something beautiful from their shared brokenness. The bakery would open again tomorrow. Bread would be baked, customers would come, and life would continue its forward motion. But tonight was for rest, for gratitude, for acknowledging how far they'd traveled from those dark days when silence meant invisibility and power meant the right to harm without consequence. Elena closed her eyes and listened to Jessie's heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her ear. She thought about singing, about all the forms it could take. Her father had sung with his voice. She sang with her bread, with her courage, with her refusal to disappear even when the world wanted her to. And in its own way, that was the loudest song of all. The night deepened around them, peaceful and complete. And for the first time in 18 years, Elena Garrett felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. The quiet certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, living a life she'd chosen, loved by someone who saw her completely. The fire had taken her voice, but it hadn't taken everything. She'd survived, rebuilt, and transformed herself from victim to survivor to creator. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over Copper Ridge and the bakery opened its doors, she would continue that work, one loaf of bread at a time, one small act of courage at a time, proving that the human spirit could endure even the darkest nights and still find its way toward dawn. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.